She screamed in the middle of the night, and he, despite swearing he would never touch her, rushed to her room. It was just a contract. No love, no kisses, no shared bed. But in that moment, seeing her shrink away in nightmares no one else could see, he held her, not out of obligation, but because something inside him broke. From that night on, nothing was the same. And even though they tried to follow the rules, they both knew they were crossing a line with no return. What started as a cold contract would become something neither of their hearts were prepared to feel. If this story makes you feel something real, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, where are you listening to this from? Your support is what inspires us to keep bringing stories that touch the heart. Elliot Marlowe didn't believe in love. He believed in logic, structure, and control. Love was chaos disguised as poetry, something that made men weak and reckless, and Elliot couldn't afford weakness. Not when the entire board of Marlowe Enterprises was watching his every move, not when his father's legacy and his own future hung in the balance. The condition was simple. He needed to be married for at least 1 year to become the permanent CEO. A clause buried in the company's founding charter by his grandfather, a man obsessed with image and family values. Elliot saw it for what it was, a legal obstacle, nothing more. So he did what any cold, calculating billionaire would do. He drafted a contract, no intimacy, no emotional involvement, no public scandals. 1 year. He didn't want romance. He needed a partner who could disappear into the background, fulfill the appearance of a loving wife when necessary, and vanish the moment the ink on the divorce papers dried. And then he met Delaney Rhodes. She entered his office like a whisper, quiet, composed, yet strangely distant. She was nothing like the society girls who paraded in designer heels and perfect smiles. Her hands were ink-stained, her eyes tired, and her voice carried a softness that hinted at battles she never talked about. She was an artist, once celebrated, now nearly invisible. Delaney had vanished from the public eye after a scandal that wasn't hers to own, an abusive ex-fiancé, a broken engagement that played out on social media, a series of panic attacks that silenced her paintbrush. She had lost everything: gallery contracts, trust, and her sense of safety. All she wanted was to start over, far from the noise. Elliot's offer was terrifying and strangely safe. A fake marriage with a powerful man who promised protection, privacy, and 1 year without demands. No emotional obligations, no romantic lies. Just silence, distance, and security. Delaney signed. And just like that, they became husband and wife, in paperwork only. Their wedding was held in a marble courthouse under gray skies. No guests, no rings, just 2 signatures and a silent agreement. We don't talk about feelings. They moved into Elliot's mansion in Asheville, North Carolina, a beautiful remote estate surrounded by thick woods and endless silence. To outsiders it was a dream. To them it was a prison made of politeness and polished marble floors. Mornings were cold and wordless. Elliot took his coffee black and read reports in silence. Delaney would sit at the far end of the long dining table, pretending to scroll through news articles while her tea grew cold. They lived in separate wings of the house, crossed paths occasionally in the hallways, exchanging awkward nods or glances that ended too quickly. Sometimes she could feel his gaze lingering, not in desire but in quiet curiosity, as if trying to understand who she was beneath the silence. Delaney didn't paint, not anymore. Her studio, a sun-drenched room on the 2nd floor, remained untouched. She spent her days wandering the empty halls, rereading old novels or sitting for hours by the window, watching the wind move through the trees. At night, she'd retreat to her room, locking the door like muscle memory. Elliot worked late, almost every night. He buried himself in spreadsheets, mergers, and projections. Business was simple, predictable. It didn't cry in the dark or flinch at sudden noises. It didn't ask him to feel. And yet, something about her silence began to unsettle him. She wasn't loud or needy. She didn't pry or provoke. But she was present, a quiet presence that echoed in the quietest corners of his home. She didn't try to change him. That was what made it harder to ignore her. Sometimes he heard her humming under her breath as she walked through the hallway barefoot. Sometimes he caught a glimpse of her curled up on the library couch, eyes closed, mouth slightly parted, as if dreaming of a life that no longer existed. And then, one evening, he saw her standing in the garden. It was late. The sky was a deep violet, and the wind carried a chill. She stood alone, arms wrapped around herself, staring up at the stars. She didn't know he was watching from the window. But something about the curve of her back, the stillness of her figure, made something stir inside him. She looked like a woman trying not to disappear. And for the first time in years, Elliot Marlowe felt something other than indifference. He looked away. The next morning the silence returned, loyal and suffocating. But something had shifted. They were strangers, yes. Bound by a contract, yes. But the air between them was no longer neutral. It hummed with something else. Not yet desire, not quite danger. It was tension, soft, lingering, dangerous. The kind that doesn't knock before entering. That evening, as Delaney passed by him in the hallway, their shoulders nearly brushed. She didn't look up. But Elliot paused, and for a brief second he imagined what her voice might sound like if she ever said his name with softness instead of formality. He shook the thought from his mind. This was business. It had to stay that way. Didn't it? From the outside, the Marlowe estate looked like a dream, an architectural marvel tucked away in the hills of Asheville, with sweeping balconies, manicured gardens, and windows that framed the sky like art. But inside, the silence echoed louder than any footsteps. And between its two inhabitants there lived a quiet agreement. We are strangers. Let's keep it that way. Delaney woke early every morning, though she had no reason to. She wasn't expected to do anything, say anything, or be anyone. Still, she dressed carefully, tying her chestnut hair into a low braid, pulling on sweaters with sleeves too long, and walking barefoot through the hallways like a ghost in a house that never welcomed her. Breakfast was the same every day. Elliot sitting at one end of the long oak table, absorbed in his tablet, sipping coffee in silence. Delaney sat at the opposite end, her tea untouched, eyes cast down. The only sounds were the clink of silverware and the occasional rustle of a newspaper page. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. There was an understanding between them, unspoken but firm. This wasn't a marriage in any emotional sense. It was a business arrangement, a performance for paperwork, nothing more. Elliot spent his days in the West Wing, a space converted into his home office, minimalist, cold, and efficient. He rarely left the space except for meetings downtown or dinners with shareholders. To Delaney, it seemed like he preferred the company of glowing screens and glass walls to actual people. She, on the other hand, found herself wandering, not aimlessly but quietly, as if trying to memorize the layout of a life that wasn't hers. She often stood in the doorway of the art studio he had prepared for her, pristine, sunlit, untouched. Canvases leaned against the wall, brushes still wrapped in plastic, but she never stepped inside, not yet. Her fingers itched for color, but her mind, it wasn't ready. The mansion felt like a museum of silence, every corner polished, every light automated, every room too clean to breathe in. She missed the mess of creation, the chaos of paint splatters, the smell of turpentine on her skin. Here, everything was too perfect, too still. One afternoon, while exploring the library, she found a book of poems with an old rose pressed between the pages. The flower had long since dried, its color faded, but it reminded her of something she couldn't quite name. She held it between her fingers, like a relic from a life where tenderness was still allowed. She wondered who had put it there. Maybe Elliot, before he became all marble and glass. That night, she left it on the kitchen counter, an unspoken gesture. He never mentioned it. But the next day, she found a fresh rose in a small crystal vase placed at her end of the table. It was the first thing he had ever given her. Still, they didn't speak. Evenings came with the sound of clocks ticking, the soft hum of the central air, and the occasional distant thunder rolling through the Carolina hills. Sometimes Elliot would pass her in the corridor. They'd exchange glances, nothing more. But something lingered in the silence, a question neither of them dared to ask. What would happen if we let go of the rules? But rules were safer. One night, Delaney found herself standing by the grand piano in the sitting room. She had never played, but the keys called to her in the quiet. Her fingers hovered above them, then pressed gently, producing a soft, broken chord. The sound startled her, like she'd shattered glass in a cathedral. Elliot heard it. He stood quietly in the hallway, watching her from the shadows. She didn't notice. She was too focused on the sound, too lost in the unfamiliar feeling of letting herself exist out loud again. He didn't interrupt. He couldn't. She looked beautiful like that, not in the way society measured beauty, but in the way people looked when they were alone and unguarded, when the weight they carried wasn't on display. For a second, he forgot the contract, the company, the risk. He only saw her. Delaney stopped playing after a few scattered notes, embarrassed by her own boldness. She turned off the lamp and walked back to her room, unaware that Elliot stayed there in the dark for several minutes, staring at the keys. The next morning, he was already gone when she entered the dining room, but a note had been left near her teacup. Just 4 words, written in clean, restrained handwriting. "Play again tonight. E." It was the first time he'd written to her. She folded the note gently and kept it in her sweater pocket all day. That night, she sat by the piano again. And this time she didn't play for herself. She played for the silence between them, for the quiet things neither had said. And somewhere in the house, Elliot Marlowe paused whatever he was doing and simply listened. Neither of them knew what they were becoming, but something had begun, something that made the silence feel just a little less empty. The rain came fast that evening, sudden and wild, sheets of water hammering against the tall windows of the Marlowe estate like an urgent knock. Thunder rolled over the hills of Asheville, deep and raw, shaking the silence that had become routine between them. Delaney stood in the hallway outside the library, arms wrapped around herself. She had gone to fetch a blanket from the sitting room when the lights flickered and went out for just a second, barely enough to matter, but enough to make her heart clench. Storms still triggered her. She told herself it was just weather, just noise. But her breath caught in her throat, and her hand grazed the wall to steady herself. Behind her, footsteps. Quiet, measured. Him. Elliot rarely left his office before midnight, especially not without warning. But tonight was different. They both froze for a second when their eyes met. The hallway was dim, lit only by flickering sconces. Her sweater clung to her arms from the humidity. His tie was loosened, top button undone, rare, human. She had never seen him like that. Neither spoke. Then, without warning, her foot caught the edge of a rug. It wasn't a dramatic fall. She didn't scream or stumble wildly. It was just a quick shift, a sharp inhale and a moment of imbalance. But Elliot reacted instantly. In 2 steps, he reached her. His hand gripped her waist, firm and instinctive. His other hand pressed against her upper arm to steady her. She hadn't expected to feel anything. But the moment his skin touched hers through the fabric, the world seemed to halt. It wasn't the touch itself that shocked her. It was the way her body reacted, the stillness, the heat, the awareness of his breath so close to her temple. His grip wasn't tight, but it grounded her. And for the first time since stepping into that mansion, she didn't feel like she was falling anymore. They didn't move, they didn't blink, just a second, maybe 2. But something passed between them in that second, something that made the air taste different, like the moment before a match is struck, like the space between a question and its answer. Elliot let go first, not quickly, but deliberately. "Sorry," he said, voice low, controlled. She nodded. "It's fine." But her voice was quieter than usual, almost breathless. He stepped back, adjusting the cuff of his shirt like the touch hadn't mattered, like it hadn't ignited something neither of them had planned for. But it had. She stood still long after he disappeared into the hallway. Her body still remembered his touch, not just where his fingers had been, but what they had undone inside her. That night, dinner was quiet, but different. Elliot ate slower. His eyes drifted toward her more often. He didn't speak, but something in his posture had softened, like his frame no longer held itself with the same rigid tension. Delaney sat with her fork in hand, pretending to read a recipe book that had been left on the counter. She wasn't reading. She was wondering. Why had he touched her like that? Why had it felt like more? Later that evening, she sat on the windowsill in her bedroom, knees pulled to her chest, watching the rain slide down the glass. The storm was quieter now, but the storm inside her was not. She closed her eyes, exhaled. The contract had been clear. No physical contact, no blurred lines, no false intimacy. But what happened when your body craved something your heart didn't yet understand? Elliot, meanwhile, sat in his office, staring at a blank document on his screen. He couldn't focus. Not on numbers, not on projections, not after what had just happened. It was supposed to be a reflex, that's all, a reaction. A human instinct, but it hadn't felt reflexive. It had felt like permission, like something in her posture had silently asked to be held, and something in him had desperately wanted to answer. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. This wasn't the plan. She wasn't supposed to matter. She wasn't supposed to feel like a question he was scared to answer. And yet he couldn't forget the way her breath had caught, the way she had leaned ever so slightly into him before pulling back. He wondered if she'd felt it too, that split second where something ancient and human had sparked between their bodies. Not lust, not yet, but something more primal, a need for closeness, a craving for warmth. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the rain softened into a hush. Inside, something had changed, in both of them. Elliot closed his eyes and whispered into the dark, as if trying to convince himself it was nothing. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. The scream shattered the night like glass. Elliot jolted awake in the darkness, his breath caught halfway in his chest. For a second he didn't move, trying to determine if it had been part of a dream or something real. But then came the second cry. Raw, guttural. A sound no one fakes. And this time, he was already out of bed, feet on the cold floor, heart pounding with something unfamiliar. Fear. For her. Delaney. He didn't stop to think. He didn't stop to weigh the rules. No clauses, no contracts, no distance, just instinct. He crossed the hall, pushed open her bedroom door, and found her twisted in the sheets, fighting something invisible in her sleep. Her face was contorted in panic, lips trembling with silent cries, her hands clutching at air like she was trying to escape something that had long since passed. He hesitated only a second. Then he walked to her and sat on the edge of the bed. "Delaney," he said softly, like trying not to scare a bird away. "You're dreaming." But she didn't wake. She whimpered again, a broken sound, curling away from the sound of his voice. He reached out, slowly, one hand on her shoulder, then the other behind her back, pulling her gently toward him. And then she did something that neither of them expected. She melted into him. Her body collapsed against his like it had been waiting for this exact embrace, like some part of her, even in sleep, knew where it was safe. Her head fell against his chest. Her fingers gripped the fabric of his shirt like a lifeline, and her sobs softened. He wrapped his arms around her fully then, held her the way no one ever had. Not for show, not for sex, not for rescue, but just to say, "I'm here. You can rest now." And she did. Her breathing slowed, heartbeat calmed, muscles loosened. She fell asleep in his arms. Elliot didn't move, not for a long time. He stayed there, his hand slowly moving up and down her back, his chin resting gently on her head, the scent of her hair, faintly floral, soft, grounding him in a moment he never saw coming. He should have left. That would have been the professional thing, the smart thing. But he couldn't. He watched her as the storm outside began to fade, listened to her breathe, felt the weight of her trust resting against his ribs, and in that stillness, something inside him cracked open. Not shattered, just shifted. He laid down beside her without thinking, remaining on top of the blanket, leaving space. But she curled closer in her sleep, instinctively fitting her frame against his like puzzle pieces that had been waiting for alignment. And so he let her. His arm came around her again. They stayed like that until dawn. When the light began to creep through the curtains, Elliot opened his eyes to find her still asleep, peaceful now. He hadn't slept a minute, not because of discomfort, but because he couldn't stop watching her. The woman he'd married for convenience, the woman whose pain had reached out in the night and broken every wall he'd spent years building, the woman whose name now felt like a secret he didn't want anyone else to whisper. He hadn't realized how lonely he'd been until her head rested against his chest. When Delaney stirred, it was slow, as if her body had forgotten how to hold fear. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a second she just blinked at the morning light. Then her gaze shifted and landed on him. Her body tensed, but only for a second. Then she realized she wasn't afraid. "What?" Her voice was barely audible. "You had a nightmare," he murmured. She looked down, saw her hand resting on his chest, the closeness between them, the fact that she wasn't wearing her usual emotional armor, and yet she didn't pull away. "I'm sorry," she whispered, embarrassed, almost ashamed. "Don't be." His voice was quieter than usual, no edge, no formality. They lay there in silence, neither knowing what to say. The rules had been broken, or maybe they had broken themselves. Delaney slowly sat up, pulling the blanket with her. Her hair fell over her shoulder in waves, her sweater slipping slightly down one arm. Elliot sat up too, legs over the side of the bed, his hand resting on his knee. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her, truly looked, as if trying to memorize this version of her, raw, honest, awake in a new way. "Anytime," he said, and somehow, they both knew, it wasn't the end of a moment, it was the beginning of one. That evening, things were different, not louder, not obvious, just warmer. He left a second cup of tea on the counter for her. She folded his laundry and left it at the door of his office. They didn't talk about what happened, but they didn't need to. Because that night, when Delaney got into bed and turned off the light, she left the door slightly ajar, and Elliot noticed. He stood in the hallway for a long minute, debating. Then he stepped inside, slowly, respectfully, and sat at the edge of her bed. "Only if you want me to," he said. She reached for his hand. "Please," she whispered. And just like that, the contract they had clung to like armor began to dissolve into something neither of them could name yet. It started the next night. No words, no plan. Just Elliot, standing once again in the hallway, outside her door. His hand hovered near the doorknob for a second longer than necessary, heart caught somewhere between uncertainty and longing. Then, with quiet resolution, he stepped inside. Delaney was already under the covers, her eyes open but heavy with the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from the body, but from years of carrying too much alone. She didn't flinch, didn't ask why he was there. She simply shifted slightly, leaving space beside her. He took it. He didn't lie beneath the covers, not at first. He sat at the edge of the bed like the night before and rested his hand lightly on top of hers. She turned to face the ceiling. He watched her in the dimness, listening to the cadence of her breath as it slowly steadied. Her hand didn't move away. That was all it took. Night after night, it repeated. Sometimes he sat beside her and just held her hand. Sometimes he lay beside her, not touching, simply existing in the same vulnerable silence. And sometimes when the wind outside howled and she curled up tight, he reached for her and she let him, her head on his shoulder, her fingers brushing against his chest like a whisper of trust. It wasn't physical desire that drove him. It was something far more dangerous. He wanted her to feel safe, not just with him, with herself. Delaney didn't ask questions, but during the day her movements softened. She started humming again in the library. Once she even walked barefoot into the studio and sat on the stool, not to paint, just to be near the brushes again. She had stopped locking her door at night. That small act felt louder than any confession. Elliot noticed every shift, the way she looked at him longer during breakfast, the way her body no longer flinched when he passed by, the way her laugh had returned in fragments. She didn't smile much, but when she did, it unraveled him. He found himself waiting for it. One morning she made coffee before he came downstairs. Just one cup, his favorite blend, black with a hint of cinnamon. He didn't say thank you. She didn't expect him to, but his hand lingered near hers when he picked it up. Later that day, Elliot cancelled a meeting. He didn't say why, not even to his assistant. He just walked out of the office and drove home early. He didn't want to miss her walking barefoot across the garden path again, hair loose, skin golden under the setting sun. He hadn't realized how much noise he carried inside until her silence made space for it to settle. The fourth night, he brought a book into her room. He didn't read it aloud. He just held it in one hand while her head rested against his chest, her breath quiet and even. She had fallen asleep minutes earlier, but he stayed, not out of duty, out of something softer, something that terrified him. He was beginning to crave her presence more than his solitude. He had built his entire life on solitude, walls, control, quiet. And now he was willingly unraveling every inch of that for the sound of her breath against his skin. Delaney too had changed. In the beginning, her body had been curled tight, almost braced. Now it reached for him in her sleep. Her hand found his without fear, her cheek pressed against his chest, like she belonged there. Sometimes she mumbled words in her dreams, unintelligible things. But once he could have sworn he heard her whisper his name, and that nearly undid him. On the seventh night, something shifted again. It had been a hard day, a call from her past. Unknown number, but the voice on the other end was enough to send her hands trembling for hours. She didn't tell Elliot, not directly, but he saw it in her eyes when he walked through the door. She sat on the edge of the bed, hair wet from a bath, wrapped in one of his old t-shirts. Her knees were pulled to her chest. She didn't look up when he entered, but she didn't ask him to leave either. He sat beside her. Closed this time. Their arms touched. She didn't pull away. He said nothing for a long moment, then reached over and placed something on the nightstand, a small jar of lavender balm. "For your hands," he said, "when they shake." She stared at it, then at him. That was the moment she cried. No sobs, no drama. Just a quiet leak of tears down her cheeks, like a dam releasing the smallest thread of water. He reached out, gently brushed a tear with the back of his finger. Her skin was warm, fragile. "I don't want to be afraid in my own home," she whispered. "You won't be," he answered, voice raw. That night, he lay down fully beside her. Not on top of the covers, with her, their bodies aligned, their hands intertwined. And in the dark, nothing was said. Nothing had to be. The silence had become their language. At some point during the night, she turned toward him and placed her palm against his chest. His heart beat steady beneath her hand. "You're warm," she murmured. And Elliot, a man who had spent his life in coldness, whispered, "Only with you." The words felt terrifying. True. Neither of them slept right away. But when they did, it was together. Not as strangers, not as a performance, but as two broken things. Slowly beginning to fit. The storm came back just after midnight. Not outside, inside her. Delaney lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her chest tight with a heaviness she hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't fear exactly. It was memory. A memory she couldn't shake, couldn't name, but could feel crawling just under her skin. Elliot hadn't arrived yet. Usually by now she'd hear the soft click of the door opening, the near silent shuffle of his footsteps. He never knocked, never announced himself, but she always felt him coming. Tonight, he was late. She pulled the blanket tighter around her, trying to will the storm away. It didn't work. She didn't hear the door, but she felt him, his presence like a shift in air pressure. He stood at the edge of the room, just watching her. Even in the dark, she knew it was him. "Are you okay?" he asked. She shook her head slowly. "No." He stepped closer. The way he moved was different tonight. Not careful, not measured, but purposeful, like he'd stopped asking permission from himself. "I had a dream," she whispered, still facing the ceiling, "but this time, I didn't cry. I just felt numb." He said nothing, but she heard his breath catch. "I don't want to be alone tonight," she added, her voice barely a thread. She turned her head. Their eyes met. "I don't mean just stay," she said, voice trembling. "I mean, stay. Really stay." Elliot didn't hesitate. He slipped beneath the covers, this time beside her, not above the sheets. And for a long second, neither moved. The space between them buzzed with tension, but it wasn't fear. It was anticipation. When his hand brushed against hers, she didn't pull away. She turned toward him instead, and when her fingertips traced the line of his jaw, he closed his eyes, like her touch had just unarmed every defense he'd ever built. "Delaney," he murmured, a warning or a prayer. He wasn't sure which. But she silenced him with a kiss, soft, hesitant, searching. He didn't kiss back at first, not because he didn't want to, but because it was so unexpected, so fragile, he didn't dare break it. Then he did. Slowly, like learning her language, one syllable at a time. Their mouths moved together, like they'd done this 1,000 times in another life. Gently at first, then with rising urgency. The kind of kiss that asked questions and answered them in the same breath. The kind that said, "I see you, all of you, and I'm not afraid." His hand moved to her waist, warm and steady. Hers found the back of his neck. Their bodies pressed together through layers of fabric, but it wasn't enough. Not for what they were feeling now. Not for what they had held back for so long. He paused only once, forehead against hers. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "Yes." And that, yes, changed everything. Clothes were removed with care, not hunger, as if each button, each touch carried meaning. Her sweater slid over her shoulders like a secret finally released. His shirt fell open beneath her hands, revealing the chest she had rested against so many nights without seeing. Now she touched him with purpose. Elliot moved as if memorizing her, not devouring her, but studying her curves, her breath, the tremble in her hands. He kissed her collarbone, her shoulder, the inside of her wrist. And Delaney, she wasn't afraid. Not this time. Because his touch didn't take. It gave. He kissed her like she was made of light. And when he entered her, it wasn't the beginning of passion. It was the end of distance. There were no words after that. Just breath, skin, sound. They moved together like waves finding shore, like tension turning into rhythm, like pain transforming into something close to peace. And in that night, that holy trembling night, they weren't billionaire and artist, nor strangers bound by a contract. They were just man and woman, hurt and healing, love, unspoken but undeniable. Afterward, they didn't move. They lay tangled in each other's arms, skin to skin, heart still racing. The storm in her chest was gone, replaced by the stillness that only comes after a surrender you didn't know you needed. Elliot ran his fingers through her hair. She pressed her ear to his chest, listening to the beat of a man who had once promised never to feel. He kissed her forehead, and she whispered, "I've never felt safer." He didn't reply. He couldn't, because for the first time in years, his heart felt full. Not with victory, not with pride, but with something terrifyingly fragile. Love. He didn't know how to say it. But his arms said it. The way he held her tighter as she drifted off to sleep said it. And later, in the middle of the night when she stirred beside him and whispered his name, not in fear but in trust, he whispered back, "I'm here." She smiled in her sleep. And for once, Elliot Marlowe wasn't thinking about tomorrow, or the company, or the contract. He was thinking about the way she looked in the dark. Peaceful, whole, loved. And he knew, without question, that whatever came next, he would protect this. Protect her. Not because of duty, but because she had undone him, completely. The invitation came wrapped in ivory linen with golden embossing, elegant, extravagant, and utterly unwelcome. Delaney found it on the kitchen counter, placed carefully beside her morning tea, the Marlowe Family Foundation Gala. Black tie, formal attendance required. She knew what it meant the moment she saw it. "They want to see me," she said quietly, not asking. Just stating. Elliot didn't look up from his tablet. "My mother wants to meet you." "Officially?" Delaney ran her finger along the edge of the envelope. "You told me I wouldn't have to—" "You don't," he said, finally meeting her eyes. "But if we avoid it, she'll assume you're hiding something. Or that I am. Neither option helps us." She nodded slowly, biting the inside of her cheek. Truth be told, she was hiding something, not from him, but from the world, from the rooms full of eyes that once consumed her like gossip, from the cameras that didn't care about trauma, only spectacle. "Will you be with me the whole time?" she asked. His answer came instantly. "I won't leave your side. That should have comforted her. But her heart was already beating too loud. The night of the gala came faster than she expected. Delaney wore a deep green dress, simple, understated, elegant. It hugged her figure in a way that felt brave, not loud. Her hair fell in soft waves, and her makeup was light but careful, as if trying to look effortless while covering a war. Elliot was quiet as he watched her get ready, but when she turned to face him, something in his expression softened. "You look like power in motion," he said. She tried to smile. "I feel like a lamb in a lion's den." He reached for her hand. "Then I'll walk with you." The gala was held in a historic art museum in downtown Asheville, crystal chandeliers, golden railings, and the kind of atmosphere where even laughter felt expensive. Guests in black suits and glittering gowns filled the space, sipping champagne and trading empty compliments. Delaney held tight to Elliot's arm, her knuckles white. "Breathe," he whispered. "I'm here." But as soon as they stepped into the main hall, the whispers started. She could feel them before she heard them. The shift in air, the way conversations dipped just low enough to be about her. Strangers looked at her too long. Others pretended not to see her at all. A few smiled too wide, like trying to prove they weren't judging. Then came the photographers. Elliot turned his body slightly to shield her, but the cameras clicked anyway. Lights flashed. A few reporters called out his name, asking for statements. One even asked who designed her dress. But it wasn't until they reached the top of the stairs that she truly froze. He was there, Brandon Hale, her ex-fiancé, standing near the wine bar, champagne in hand, laughing like nothing had ever happened, like he hadn't broken her, like he didn't almost destroy her. Delaney stopped mid-step. Her breath hitched. Her fingers dug into Elliot's sleeve so hard he winced. He followed her gaze, and when his eyes found Brandon, something dark shifted across his face, something primal, protective. "You know him," Elliot said, though it wasn't a question. Delaney nodded, unable to speak. "Do you want to leave?" he asked quietly. She shook her head, swallowing the panic rising in her throat. "No. If I run, he wins." Elliot's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Then we stay." Margot Marlowe appeared moments later, poised, elegant, and sharply observant. She greeted Delaney with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You clean up well," she said with a tilt of her head. "Better than I expected." Delaney offered a polite nod. "Thank you for the invitation." Margot's smile didn't move. "Just don't embarrass the family, dear." Elliot stepped in. "Mother." But Delaney placed a hand gently on his arm. "It's fine." She had faced worse. What she didn't expect, what nearly unstrung her, was Brandon approaching. "Delaney," he said smoothly, his voice still like silk over glass. "It's been a while." She didn't answer. Couldn't. Elliot turned toward him. "You need to walk away now." Brandon lifted both hands, mocking innocence. "I'm just saying hello to an old friend." "We're not friends," Delaney said, her voice thin but steady. "We never were." Brandon's smile faltered, just for a second. "So cold. Marriage to a Marlowe will do that to you, I guess." Before Elliot could respond, Delaney did. "No," she said, louder now. "Marriage to someone kind did that." Brandon looked her up and down one last time, then shrugged. "You've always been good at playing roles." And with that he turned and disappeared into the crowd. Delaney's hands trembled, but she didn't cry. Elliot took her aside, into a quiet alcove away from the noise. "I'll have him removed," he said, furious. "No," she replied, breathless. "That's exactly what he wants. To ruin the night. To make me look weak." Elliot studied her face. "You're not weak." She met his gaze. "Not anymore." For a moment they just stood there, two people wrapped in quiet defiance. But somewhere in the distance, hidden behind crystal glasses and designer shoes, a plan had already begun. And neither of them knew. Brandon hadn't come alone. The morning after the gala, the mansion felt colder, not in temperature, in energy. Elliot stood by the window in his office, arms crossed, watching the fog roll across the hills of Asheville. His jaw was tight. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Delaney's face the moment she saw Brandon. The stiffness in her shoulders, the tremble in her fingers, The way her voice had to battle the fear inside her just to speak. He hated that. He hated that someone had that kind of power over her past. But what he hated more was the growing feeling that Brandon hadn't shown up at random, his mother's invitation, the photographers, Brandon, all on the same night. It wasn't coincidence. It was a setup. He grabbed his phone and made the call. "Find out who gave Brandon Hale an invitation to the gala," he told his head of security. "Discreetly. I want every name he interacted with that night, especially family." The answer came 2 hours later. Seth Marlowe. Of course, Elliot's cousin, ambitious, charming, opportunistic, always 2 steps behind Elliot's success and 10 steps ahead in manipulation. Seth had been circling the leadership chair at Marlowe Enterprises for years, ever since Elliot's father passed. And now, with Elliot on the cusp of finalizing full control, it seemed Seth had decided to play dirty. He didn't come for Elliot's job. He came for his peace. Elliot clenched his fists as he ended the call. Downstairs, Delaney was in the kitchen staring into a half-full mug of tea that had long since gone cold. She hadn't touched her sketchpad since the gala. The fire that had flickered back into her over the last few weeks had dimmed again, but when she looked up and saw Elliot standing in the doorway, something shifted. She could tell by the way he moved. Sharp, deliberate, protective. "You found something," she said. He nodded. Seth invited him. Her lips parted, then closed. Of course. She had seen the way Seth looked at her at the gala, with too much charm and not enough sincerity. Like she was a pawn he had already moved across the board. "I should have known," she whispered. "No," Elliot replied firmly. "I should have." He walked toward her, took her hand gently, and sat beside her at the table. "This isn't about Brandon anymore," he said. "It never was. Seth wanted to destabilize me. You were his method." Delaney's jaw tightened. "He used my trauma like a weapon." "And for that," Elliot said, his voice low and cold, "he's going to answer." She looked at him, at the quiet fury in his eyes, the calm restraint in his posture. He wasn't just a man defending his wife. He was a man who had finally made something personal, but she didn't want to be the reason he lost control. "I don't want you dragged into this," she said. "You are this," he replied, "and I'm not letting him near you again." Delaney paused. "What will you do?" "I'll start by doing something I should have done weeks ago." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a small recording device, sleek, silver, and currently blinking red. "I recorded everything," he said. "What do you mean, everything?" "I had my suspicions," he admitted. "I knew Seth was circling, so I've been collecting calls, meetings, messages, anything that even smelled like sabotage." Delaney blinked. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I never wanted you to feel like a target," he said. "But now, I think it's time you see exactly what he's been doing." He stood, walked to his office, and returned with a laptop. Together, they listened. Clips of phone calls, snippets of voice memos, recordings from shareholder lunches and boardroom corridors, and then Brandon's voice. "Just show up, smile, stir the pot. You don't even have to talk to her. Just make sure she sees you." Seth's voice replied, "One whisper of that girl's history in the wrong ear, and Elliot's golden image will collapse." Delaney's stomach turned. It wasn't just about discomfort. It was orchestration. Cruel, calculated orchestration. "She was prey to him," she said softly. "She still is," Elliot replied, "unless we take back control." Later that evening, Elliot called a private meeting with the board. No lawyers, no media, just family. Delaney didn't want to go, but Elliot looked at her and said, "He tried to erase your voice, so I'm giving you the room." She stood beside him in the conference hall, nervous, barely breathing. Seth smiled when she entered, that same smug curve of his lips that had fooled people for years, but it didn't fool her anymore. Elliot stood, played the recording. Slowly, clearly, the room fell silent. When the final word ended, Delaney stepped forward. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. "I've been followed, manipulated, hunted down by a man I escaped, and handed to him by someone in this family." She turned towards Seth. "You thought breaking me again would break Elliot, but you forgot something." She looked at Elliot. "We're not made of paper." Her hands trembled. Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. I used to be afraid of what people would say, of what they'd see when they looked at me. But not anymore. She reached into her bag and pulled out 3 canvases, small, raw, unfinished. She placed them on the table. They were messy, bold, bleeding with emotion. Let them see me now. One by one, board members stood. Some looked shocked, some ashamed. And when the vote came, it was unanimous. Seth was out. Brandon later was arrested on charges of harassment and defamation, thanks to the evidence Elliot quietly passed to authorities. Delaney didn't speak when she heard the news. She simply exhaled, as if finally, the weight was no longer hers alone to carry. And when Elliot met her eyes that night, he didn't say anything. He just opened his arms, and she walked into them, not like a woman seeking shelter, but like someone who had become her own storm. The studio had always been waiting for her. High ceilings, wide windows, afternoon light that moved across the floor like a slow breath. It smelled faintly of cedar wood and linen, clean, untouched. But beneath that stillness lived something more primal. A quiet hunger. Delaney stepped inside barefoot, as if the floor might reject her. It had been months since she held a brush. Longer since she'd felt like she deserved to. She had passed this room countless times, pausing, peeking, promising herself, not yet. But now, it was time. She stood in front of the largest canvas, white and endless, blank, but not empty. Behind her, the door clicked softly. She turned, expecting Elliot, but it was only the wind. She exhaled and picked up the brush. At first, she didn't paint shapes or figures or anything meant to be understood. She just moved. Color spilled across the canvas in angry strokes. Red slashed into black. Lines blurred, collided, tangled like memory. Her hands worked faster than thought. Her arms ached, her breath quickened. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. It was like her body had waited years to scream, and now the brush was its mouth. Blue poured out like silence, gold like hope she didn't trust yet, and in the center, a sharp smear of violet rising from shadow. Delaney didn't paint what she saw. She painted what she had survived. For hours, she lost herself. Not once did she hear Elliot enter, but he was there, leaning quietly against the doorframe, watching her. He didn't speak, didn't interrupt. He simply watched the woman he had once described in legal clauses become something infinite before his eyes. She wasn't delicate. She was fire. Every movement was raw and alive, a choreography of pain and reclamation. Her shirt was streaked with color, her cheeks flushed. Strands of hair clung to her temples, but her eyes were alive again. She didn't know he was crying until she turned. She froze when she saw him, brush hovering mid-air. "I didn't mean to," he began, but she shook her head. "It's okay." He took a slow step inside. "I've never seen you like this." She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. "Neither have I." He moved closer, cautiously, as if nearing something sacred. "What is it?" he asked, nodding toward the canvas. She looked at it, wild, unapologetic, chaotic, her soul unfiltered. "It's not what it is," she said. "It's what it isn't." He raised a brow. "It isn't controlled. It isn't afraid. It isn't edited for approval." Elliot studied her face. "It's you." Her throat tightened. For the first time in years, they stood in silence, breathing in the scent of paint and wood, the kind of silence that wasn't awkward, but reverent. "I thought I lost her," she whispered. "The girl who used to paint like this. I buried her so deep I didn't think I could ever—" She trailed off. Elliot stepped beside her, gaze still fixed on the canvas. "She wasn't lost," he said gently. "She was waiting for the world to stop screaming." Delaney looked up at him, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "You make it quiet enough to hear myself again," she whispered. He didn't answer, but he reached for her hand, paint-stained, trembling, real, and lifted it to his chest. "I didn't fall in love with your silence," he said. "I fell in love with what was trapped behind it." The words hung in the air like dust in sunlight. He hadn't said it before, not directly, not like this. Delaney's lips parted, stunned, not by the confession, but by the way it felt so true. like he hadn't decided to love her, like he simply had all along, and her response didn't come in words. She pulled him in, held him tightly, and for the first time, he felt paint on his own skin. Later, she kept painting. Elliot stayed nearby and in the doorway and the hallway on the floor beside her. He read while she worked, sometimes in silence, sometimes aloud. Sometimes he just watched. When she cursed at a stubborn corner or cried without warning, he didn't ask why. He just offered water, or space, or a hand to hold when her own hands couldn't stop shaking. Her second painting was smaller, a woman with her back turned to a rising fire, walking barefoot into a violet sea. Her third was of hands reaching out from behind a glass wall. Her fourth was a man. Not his face exactly, but his posture, his stillness, his hand reaching out, not to save, but to say, "I'll wait." When she finished, she looked at him and asked softly, "Do you see yourself in it?" He nodded. "But it's not about me." She smiled faintly. "It's about what you gave me, without taking anything." They kissed then, not with urgency, but with knowing, like a promise had already been made between their silences. That night, Delaney cleaned her brushes slowly, like tucking in children. Elliot watched from the threshold. "You're opening the gallery again, aren't you?" he asked. She paused, then nodded. "But not for critics, not for money, not to prove anything." She turned to face him fully. "I want to open it for women like me, for the ones who stopped painting, or stopped speaking, or stopped believing they mattered." Elliot's throat tightened. "Then you should." She walked to him, pressed a paint-streaked kiss to his cheek and whispered, "Only because you stayed long enough for me to remember who I was." And as he watched her walk away, her feet bare, hair loose, eyes bright, Elliot Marlowe realized she wasn't the one being saved anymore. She was saving herself. The boardroom was colder than Delaney remembered. Not in temperature, in atmosphere. Dark wood panels, tall-backed leather chairs, a long glass table that reflected more power than warmth. Around it sat a dozen men and women who held the future of Marlowe Enterprises in their hands. Faces unreadable, suits immaculate. Elliot stood at the head of the table, calm, composed, but with something sharper in his eyes, not just resolve, but fire. Seth sat halfway down, legs crossed, confidence oozing from every gesture. He didn't glance at Delaney when she entered. He didn't need to. His smirk said everything. She was just the wife, the weak spot, the liability. Until today. Elliot nodded once to the room. "Before we begin the vote on leadership succession, there's something you all need to hear." He reached into his folder and pressed play on a small recorder. Brandon Hale's voice filled the room, dripping with arrogance. "She won't fight back. Just show up. She'll crack on her own." Then Seth's voice, cold and calculating. One whisper of her past, and Elliot's clean image crumbles. The silence afterward was absolute. No coughs, no shifting in seats, just shock. Elliot's gaze swept across the table. "I had suspicions, so I started recording meetings, conversations. Some were legal, some weren't." He looked directly at Seth. "But all of them were real." Seth laughed once, a hollow, forced thing. "You're bluffing." "I'm not." Elliot turned to the assistant seated in the corner. "Please distribute the transcriptions." One by one, board members received the printed proof. Seth's words, his strategy, his collusion with a known abuser. Delaney stood behind Elliot, hands clasped tightly in front of her. She hadn't planned to speak. She told herself she'd let the evidence do the talking. But when Seth scoffed again and muttered, "She's just a prop in a performance," something in her snapped. She stepped forward, not timidly, not seeking permission. She walked to the center of the room. "I was silent for a long time," she said, voice steady, though her hands trembled, "because I thought my story would make people uncomfortable. I thought pain had to be hidden to be respected." Every eye turned to her. "I was wrong." She turned toward Seth. "You called me a liability. You tried to use my trauma as a weapon, but the truth is, I'm not the weak one here. I survived what you never could have, and I didn't survive it to stay quiet anymore." She opened the leather portfolio in her arms. Inside 3 canvases, small, raw, powerful. She placed them one by one on the table, a woman walking barefoot through broken glass, a heart stitched together, bleeding through gold thread. And finally, a hand reaching from fire, not for rescue but to rise. "This is what I've lived," she said, "what I've painted, what I've carried." She met the eyes of each board member. "My name is Delaney Rhodes Marlowe. I'm not a symbol, I'm not a mistake, and I will not be used." Elliot watched her in silence, eyes shining, chest full. He had never been more certain of anything in his life than in that moment. She wasn't his weakness, she was his strength. One of the older board members cleared her throat. "I think we've heard enough." A vote was called, and one by one the voices came. I. Seth stood, furious. "You can't just—" "Yes, we can," said the chairwoman at the head of the table. "You've been caught manipulating the board and endangering the company's public image. You're finished." 2 guards entered quietly. Seth looked at Elliot one last time, eyes narrowed. "You think this makes her untouchable?" "No," Elliot replied, "but it makes her undeniable." Seth was escorted out. Delaney stood still, heart pounding, unsure whether to collapse or scream. Elliot crossed the room and took her hand. She looked up at him, tearful and breathless. "You did it," he whispered. "No," she said. "We did." Later that night, back at the mansion, Delaney stood barefoot in the garden under strings of soft lights. Elliot came up behind her, arms wrapping around her waist. "You know," he murmured, "they didn't clap in that room, but they should have." She smiled against his chest. "I wasn't doing it for applause." "I know," he said. "You were doing it to take your voice back." She turned in his arms. "And maybe," she added, "to remind myself I'm not afraid to be seen anymore." They kissed then, deep, slow, full of everything they hadn't said in the boardroom. When they pulled apart, Elliot looked down at her and said, "You were never just a name on a contract to me, but today you became something else." "What?" He touched her cheek. "Unstoppable." The fire crackled softly in the hearth. Outside, the Carolina evening was cool and quiet, the kind of night that wrapped itself around the house like a lullaby. Inside, Elliot stood in the study holding a thin stack of papers, once so powerful, now trembling slightly in his hand. Delaney sat cross-legged on the rug, barefoot, wearing one of his sweaters. Her face was lit only by the soft amber light of the fire, and the faint curve of a smile touched her lips as she watched him. "Are you sure?" she asked gently. Elliot looked down at the paper, their marriage contract. Clause after clause, all in precise legal language. No intimacy, no expectations, no emotional entanglement. He let the silence hang a moment longer, then nodded. "Yes?" He knelt beside her, holding the first page over the flame. For a second the corner curled, then it caught fire, glowing bright and orange. One by one he fed the sheets to the flames, watching each paragraph, each rule, each line of distance between them vanish into ash. Delaney watched, her chest tight. She remembered signing that document in a cold conference room. No flowers, no vows, just signatures and silence. She had agreed because it gave her safety. He had offered because he feared vulnerability. And yet here they were, in a room now filled with warmth. When the last page turned to ember, Elliot turned to her. "I don't want anything between us anymore," he said. "No conditions, no contracts, just choice." Delaney's breath caught. He reached into his jacket pocket, not rushed, not theatrical, and pulled out a small velvet box. "I bought this the day I realized I didn't want to go back to who I was before you." She stared, heart pounding, as he opened it. A simple ring, gold, timeless, no diamonds, just honest light. He took her hand, the same hand that had once trembled signing a contract, now steady in his palm. "I married you because I had to," he said quietly, "but I fell in love with you because I couldn't help it." Delaney's eyes welled with tears. Elliot continued, "I fell for the way you walk barefoot through silence, the way you paint like you're tearing down walls, the way you smile when you don't know anyone's watching." He swallowed. "And for the way you saw me, not as a title or a name, but as someone capable of being more." Delaney covered her mouth, overwhelmed. "So this time," he said, voice raw, "I'm not asking as a CEO. I'm asking as a man who's finally ready to risk everything." He held up the ring. "Will you marry me, for real this time?" The tears slid freely down her cheeks, not because she was unsure, but because of how certain she was. She nodded, breathless. "Yes." And when he slipped the ring onto her finger, it didn't feel like the beginning of something new. It felt like coming home. Later that night, they lay wrapped in a blanket by the fireplace. No urgency, no words, just soft hands and full hearts. Delaney traced circles on Elliot's chest, the new ring warm against his skin. "This house doesn't feel cold anymore," she whispered. He kissed her forehead. "It's not the house." She looked up at him, eyes curious. "Then what is it?" He brushed her cheek. "It's you." She smiled softly, heart full. "And you." They talked about everything that night, about fears and futures, about how strange it felt to live without armor. She told him about the studio she dreamed of opening, not a gallery but a space for women who had lost their voices, a place for messy beauty, raw truth. He told her about stepping back from the company, not entirely, but enough to breathe again, enough to feel his life, not just manage it. "When did we become real?" she asked. "Sometime between midnight and sleep." Elliot thought for a moment. "The night I broke the claws to hold you," he said, "or maybe the night you held me back." She kissed him softly, then rested her head on his chest. "Let's never go back," she whispered. "We won't," he promised. We burned the map, and as the fire dimmed, they drifted to sleep, tangled, warm, and entirely unguarded. The next morning, Delaney moved her art into the once-empty guest room beside their bedroom. It became her new studio, the hallway filled with the scent of oils and turpentine. The walls bloomed with color, and the house, the one that once echoed with silence, now pulsed with life. They made breakfast together, took walks without bodyguards, watched old movies under too many blankets, and at night Elliot would pull her close and whisper, "I'm violating Clause 5C again," just to make her laugh, because now there were no rules between them, only promises. The garden had never looked so alive. Wildflowers climbed the stone walls like music. Lanterns swayed gently from tree branches. White chairs faced a simple wooden arch wrapped in eucalyptus and ivory roses. The sky above Asheville was clear and soft, like it had been waiting for this day too. Delaney stood beneath the arch in a flowing dress the color of moonlight, barefoot on the grass. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, a single wildflower tucked behind her ear. No veil, no diamonds. Just the warmth of late spring and the eyes of the man she loved watching her like he couldn't believe she was real. Elliot wore no tie. His sleeves were rolled, his hand steady in hers. It wasn't a grand wedding. Just a small circle of people, a few close friends, 2 board members who had voted with courage, and Margot Marlowe, who now held her son's hand with silent pride. No photographers, no press, just love. Vows were spoken in soft voices, promises made not with grandeur but with memory. "I choose you," when it's quiet, when it's hard, when it's real. That was all Delaney needed to hear. And when Elliot kissed her this time, it wasn't the end of a performance. It was the beginning of something ordinary and sacred. They danced barefoot under the string lights, ate cake with their fingers, laughed so hard at one point they had to sit down in the grass to catch their breath. Later that night, they slow danced alone to an old vinyl playing in the living room, her cheek pressed to his chest, his hands resting low on her back. "I wish I could bottle this," she whispered. "You did," he said. "In me." A few months later, Delaney's fingers trembled for an entirely different reason. 2 pink lines. She laughed and cried at the same time, standing barefoot in the bathroom, holding the test like it might disappear. Then she walked down the hall and placed it silently on Elliot's desk. He looked at it, then at her. No words, just tears, and then joy. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her once before pulling her into the kind of hug that said, "You've already given me everything, and still you're giving more." The pregnancy wasn't easy. She was sick for weeks, moody, sleepy, vulnerable in new ways. But Elliot was there. Every appointment, every craving. Every moment she doubted herself. When she worried she wouldn't know how to mother, he whispered, "You already do. Every time you love without needing permission." They named their son Leo. He arrived on a rainy night in early spring, red-faced and furious, lungs strong and voice even stronger. When the doctor placed him in Delaney's arms, she stared at him in awe. Tiny fists, full lips, a soul she already knew. Elliot stood beside her, unable to speak. His hand trembled as he touched Leo's head, and then he sank to his knees beside the bed, pressing his forehead to hers. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't know I could love like this." She kissed his eyelids. "Neither did I." 16 months later, Maisie came along, all softness and calm like moonlight in human form. She was born in the same hospital, in the same room, but this time Elliot held Delaney's hand the entire time, whispering affirmations through her contractions, eyes wet with reverence. They became a family not all at once, but in waves. Sleepless nights, sticky fingers, milk-stained shirts, first words, first steps, first colds. They learned how to fall asleep in shifts, how to grocery shop one-handed, how to rock a baby and still dance in the kitchen after midnight. Delaney opened her gallery that fall, not just for her, for others. A space filled with paintings by women who had survived in silence. Art that wasn't pretty but honest. Stories told in brushstrokes. Pain turned to color. Healing offered without condition. She called it the quiet room. It became more than a gallery. It became a movement. Elliot scaled back his work, delegated, let go of his need to control every corner of the empire he'd once lived to protect. He chose morning walks with Leo over breakfast meetings. He chose evening baths with Maisie over boardroom banter. And sometimes, late at night when the kids were finally asleep, he and Delaney would curl up on the couch in silence, not needing to talk, just breathing in the stillness they had earned. On their 3rd anniversary, Elliot placed a small gift box on her pillow. Inside was a folded piece of paper, burned slightly at the edges. It was a replica of their original contract, only this time rewritten by hand. Clause 1. Touch her every day. Clause 2. Say what you feel. Clause 3. Protect her freedom, not your pride. Clause 4. Choose her again, always. Clause 5. Break every clause if it means keeping her heart safe. At the bottom he had signed, "For the only contract I'll never break." She cried, of course she did. And then she kissed him like the world was new. Because for them, it was. She wasn't looking for a fairy tale. She just wanted one day for love to stop hurting. And he had never planned to love. But in the end, it wasn't the terms of the contract that brought them together. It was the embrace in silence. It was the choice to stay. It was the courage to burn the rules to live what neither of them dared to dream. Because true love begins when we choose freely to start over. If this story touched you, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us, where are you listening to this message from? Your support is what allows us to keep bringing stories like this.